So it's great to be able to give this talk here at the it's the arts department of Concordia University. It's not the art history department, it's arts department. Studio arts, okay. So I might not read this appallingly dull text of 16 pages. I'm gonna maybe scroll through it in another way. First of all, first and foremost, much more important than art historians are artists. Tomorrow, one of the artists of the biennial, Benjamin Serrar, who is here, will continue his performance, the Marcia's Hour. Tomorrow it will be in English at Studio 303 in the Belgo building at 7 o'clock. Please come en masse. It's unique. You have a chance tomorrow and the day after. It's a unique experience to be part of this performance, but it's also first there, first served. So when we're fully booked, we're fully booked. Anyway, welcome to you all. What I'm going to do is not necessarily a talk about the biennial. I think the biennial should surprise you. I'm not going to disclose. I'm going to disclose things, but you wouldn't know. But I think it's great. Art is there to be seen, not to be explained too much. Maybe explanations come afterwards, discussions come afterwards. So it's very important to have like an impression from the works, the exhibition, freshly. But still some things that I'm going to talk about have maybe inspired. It's an atmosphere that inspired some thoughts, some ideas around the biennial, and I tentatively called the talk Darkness. So I'll start with one of my favorite authors, Nathaniel Hawthorne. Probably some of you know him from his most famous book, The Scarlet Letter. But he wrote this fantastic short story, Ethan Brand. And Ethan Brand traces the domestication of the image imbued with life. The main character, Mr. Brand, returns to his village after an 18-year search for the unpardonable sin. Brand oozes an uncanny coldness and is rather unapproachable, like very typical characters in Hawthorne. Also, Dr. Rappaccini is this kind of scientific who is cold, who has no empathy. A rarity show, and this, because I didn't know what a rarity show was, and then I searched for it, and it's this kind of like 19th century proto-cinematic devices. You know, it's kind of like they move images through lenses and then they magnify and they do weird things. So a guy with a rarity show arrived in the village and vainly seeks to entertain the youths with an antiquated device. And so it doesn't work very well. It's a bit used, it's jaded, until a boy, playful, puts his head in the box. And of course, there were versions with more glass in it. And a very lively image appears. So all of a sudden, the entertainment and the fascination is there. So I quote Hawthorne, viewed through the magnifying glasses, the boy's round, rosy visage assumed the strangest imaginable aspect of an immense titanic child, the mouth grinning broadly and the eyes and every other feature overflowing with fun at the joke. Diverted from its intended use, the rarity show becomes fascinating again, in an actualization of its function performed by the boy, until the cold observer appears. So Mr. Brand, who returned to the village, and he fixates the boy. He looks through the glasses at the boy. I quote Hawthorne again. Suddenly, however, that merry face turned pale, and its expression changed to horror, for this easily impressed and excitable child had become sensible that the eye of Ethan Brand was fixed upon him through the glass. End of quote. A lonely, intelligent, and heartless gaze pierces the boy, whose expression freezes into an image. He changes from an actor into an observed object. He is exposed to the scientific gaze of Ethan Brand, the cold observer. In Hawthorne's critical stance towards a progressing modernity, it is this mean and expecting gaze that is the unpardonable sin, what Ethan Brand was searching for, the gaze that disenchants the world. Hawthorne diagnoses a crisis in the 19th century at the moment modernity breaks through, in which both art and science lose, insofar as one does not include the other. In Hawthorne's pessimistic view, this provokes alienation, hallucination, disenchantment, and fear, which all take hold of the subject. Hawthorne, of course, belongs to a romanticist movement, writing cautionary tales in a pessimistic, dark tone that suggests that guilt, sin, and evil are the most inherent natural qualities of humanity. Many of his tales and novels focus on a type of historical fiction, though Hawthorne's depiction of the past is used only as a vehicle to express themes of ancestral sin, guilt, and retribution. But most of the time it's also about the image, and it's about how an image comes into being, or how a certain type of image comes into being. An image that is standing still. Normally, it's a very fairly modern invention. If you see at Rubens' paintings, they move. Although it's a still image, they move. It's like as if it's the proto-action cinema. The whole idea of a still image is something that is kind of like progressively thematized with modernity. And it induces fear. Images have always been considered alive. So that's why we go back after the cold gaze to something else, which is kind of like in dialectics, with this idea of the image that is standing still, and because of its stillness, induces fear. This is Cairo, Egypt, and you see this wonderful statue of Ramses II. And I'm going to talk about a film. Let's first see these images. That's later. This is how it was. That's a couple of years later. It's on the same spot. And this is what I'm going to talk about. I might have to get out of the thing and look at the movie. Where do I have it? Let's look at this movie a little bit. It's a film by French artist David Guérin-Trétiakov, and it's called One God Passing. You'll have to wait a bit. I'll put it a little more silent. So, can you still hear me with the sound in the background? Good. David Guérin-Trétiakov's film One God Passing documents a real situation in which an opposite logic to the Hawthorne story is unleashed in the streets of modern urban Cairo. The huge granite statue of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II was moved overnight from downtown Cairo to a place near the Great Pyramids at a stately pace on 2 flatbed trucks. I think this is the end of it. I have to... Sorry, I'm in the wrong place. Let's see if it works. No, that's not. Yeah. So it's moved overnight on 2 flatbed trucks. Tens of thousands of people came out to watch it go by in a goodbye mood to the godlike pharaoh sculpture that used to be an evident part of their urbanity. You've seen it on that space. It was Ramses Midan, Ramses Square. The head of Ramses protruding from the protective steel to hold the statue steady was wrapped in plastic and thick padding, but its face was visible to the crowds lining the streets. There were people chanting Allah Akbar and waving V signs. There was clearly jubilation in the air. The people sensed that they were participation in a very important event. But there is discussion about the possible signification of said event. In the by and large Muslim country, some denounced fiercely the excitement for the Sanam, the false idol, while others reacted with as much inflammation, chanting that the pharaoh is part of their heritage and thus can't be a false idol, carefully but then more and more overtly denunciating at the same time their actual leaders, at that time still Mubarak, as the real false idols, like the real Sanam. Trétiakov combines his own images with footage taken from Egyptian television, subtly shifting between official reporting and creative participation. The camera heightens the natural sense for drama of some of the protagonists on the streets, what you see here. But at the same time, Trétiakov himself goes with the flow and becomes a medium of the multiplicity, of the agencies that cross us even if we don't necessarily recognize them. So it's a very interesting thing. The official people didn't expect this to happen. Thousands of people came to the streets because of this statue moving from Ramses Square to the pyramids, where it becomes reified as a tourist kind of trophy. And it kind of unleashes these incredible discussions on the street about religion, about politics. It's chanting. It's all kind of the different approaches are negotiated in the streets with thousands of people. So what is important is strange that this kind of statue, the image, again, it's an image, releases a hallucinatory mode of public perception. For ancient Egyptian culture, statues took the place of the divinity and were necessarily considered animated. So here you have this indeed this oppositional thing to what happens in the Nathaniel Hawthorne story. The famous Ka of the Egyptians was the soul of the statue in the form of its shadow. The statue is moved at night. Obviously the time with less traffic, it was a pragmatic thing. But an ancient belief would provoke a nocturnal shadow. There is a tradition in ancient Egypt that even at night you have a shadow, although you cannot see it. And the nocturnal shadow differentiates itself from the natural ways things go, in opposition to a shadow in daylight. Although the crowd is supposed to know better, and the statue doesn't move but is pulled forward, they negotiate an ancient belief, the people on the street, that images of gods might become imbued with divine force and acquire movement, which on its turn could be considered an unpardonable sin in a Muslim environment. In both Hawthorne's story about Ethan Brandt and Tretyakhov's documentary of the movement of Ramses II's statue, there is an unease with images that at the same time oppose one another. Both the iconic and the optical are forbidden to be animated. The uncontrollable, uncontained image is refused by both science and religion. Tretyakov's film suggests to drop that fear for the unpardonable sin and to partake actively in new productions of subjectivity and invest in the articulation of collective agency, towards what Félix Guattari once called an agencement collectif d'énonciation. The subject then is no longer an isolated, lonely individual that... Very good. Okay, did you see Ramses already? Where is he? No, that's not here. Here he is.
There he is.
It's people are really looking at it from, yeah, there he is, voilà. That was the incredible thing. It's quite impressive. It's a very, very strange moment. The film will be somewhere in the Bible. So the subject then is no longer an isolated, lonely individual that has to provide the world with meaning, but is part of a disposition that interacts with an environment and a group in permanent evolution. So meaning is not that what the cold observer projects on things. You know, it's kind of like, we adopt a little bit of the criticism of Hawthorne, but we also kind of cherish that. So what I'm interested in is kind of like the type of, the kind of the dialectic between, let's say, inanimate and animation. How images kind of function, how you can like either know things by setting them still, or experience things by putting them in movement. And movement can be metaphorical, it's not necessarily a physical movement. But you see here literally what that means. It's kind of like animism happening right there, which is quite amazing. Good, that's for Ramses. I have to get back to the... Oh, wait. So you see he was standing here. Here are some stills from the movie. Now we go to another inspiration. A couple of decades before Nathaniel Hawthorne's creative and active writing time, in France, on the other side of the ocean, another author, Donatien Alphonse François Marquis de Sade, developed a literary oeuvre that embraced the modernity of the Enlightenment. So he's different from Hawthorne. He's not a romantic. He is an enlightened philosopher. But at the same time, he uses logical argumentation related to rationalism to the point of absurdity, unveiling reason's weaknesses or reason's kind of dead ends. The transition, and that's a very important thing, that's what a lot of people, I'm afraid, get wrong, from his perverse sexuality to his transgressive literature brings into play a whole network of symbolic relationships. The possibility of discovering within the fantasized act a symbolic world that would find textual expression and fulfillment through literature. It's also reported that the Sade was horrified by torture of the Robespierre government. So it's kind of like, it's not that what he writes is something he really enjoys or believes. It's kind of like he creates a world that is possible in literature. Of course, he had a libertine life, but at the same time, the transgression happens in language. It's not in real. And that's a very, very important thing, that a big part of the Sade's writings is the fantasy around it. It works because he suggests the fantasy that he had a life that is kind of reflected in the books. And of course, he was imprisoned, and of course, he had a libertine lifestyle, but at the same time, he was not how do you say that, like a terrible sadist in that sense, because he kind of criticized that in other letters. Paradoxically, although he created a language and a world through language, some consider his text essentially unreadable. Not because certain passages are unpleasant, but because the written word is like an instrument of torture directed against the reader. Sometimes it's appallingly dull. It's very boring. It's repetitive. It is, amongst other things, this type of torture that interests me a lot. We want to concentrate, or I would like to concentrate, also in the exhibition, on perversion as an aesthetic category and not necessarily a moral one. In his foreword to Sade Fourier Loyola, Roland Barthes situates the Marquis de Sade as a founder of language, a logothèque. But if Sade is a founder of language, even if the opposite appears to be, it is according to Barthes for saying nothing. And that's the very interesting thing. He creates a void. It's not documentary. A very important thing for this biennial, it is not documentary. Even if the images of David Guérin-Tretyakov appear documentary, they're not there for their documentary value. They're there for their hallucinatory value. They're there for something else. Sade is not only subversive on the level of content. His philosophy of evil, criminal contamination, his sadism and his amoral discourse. Barthes advanced the idea that the most profound subversion operates in the foundation of a discourse, in the act of inventing a new language, rather than in the provocation inherent in the promotion of doctrines that can scandalize people with morals. And in that way, also the most enjoyable transgression. So, acting as an inventor of language, he is also inventing the most enjoyable transgression. This new language is an all-enveloping system, a secondary language that isolates the adherent from the conventional world. Moreover, Sade constructs a language changing the hierarchy between sound and image, privileging the latter over the former. A very important thing, you know, like our Western belief and culture is based on the Word was with God. So God enunciates himself first as Word. Yeah? While that's completely ridiculous. The first thing that's there about the world is image. Yeah? And the Sade is very clear on that the first thing that there is image, because the other thing is like installing a hierarchy with a discipline towards the hierarchy. And the religion says it very clear, the Christian religion says it, auditum verbi Dei id est fides. It's about fidelity. You have to believe, because it's something you cannot believe. It's an irrationality. And the very interesting thing is the first thing we make about the world are images. Words explain images. They don't explain the world. Words, again, then have to kind of like be uploaded with images in order to kind of like make text imaginable. So there is this very interesting place of text, and Marquis de Sade is extremely critical about it. The place of text is kind of like secondary to image. The first kind of like counterfact we make about the world is image. And in the Sade, that's very interesting because what he does mostly, he brings into play all his imaginative and descriptive talents. And in the same way, it's in the same way that neoclassical painters reproduced paintings of classical statues than of real people, and he imagined paintings and attitudes. The notions themselves are taken from the language of the studio. He really describes it as attitudes, as tableaus. He uses the language of the painter studio to describe these kind of things he wants to describe. And of course, they look like neoclassical paintings. And if you read some of the excerpts, it looks like this. Nowadays, that action is gone out of it. You know, this is a piece of Isa Genskin, which will be on view in the biennial. And it's very interesting. There is there's a reminiscence of this kind of like images of people in certain kind of interaction. But there is no interaction anymore. It goes back to Nathaniel Hawthorne in a way. You know, it's a still image. The action is gone. The animation is taken out of it. While in the neoclassical and in the Sade world, the animation is still there. So he really talks about paintings, attitudes, about dispositio and inventio, and his inventio verged on the unbelievable. He invents positions of people that are almost unbelievable. His living paintings, and he calls them himself like that, just like many paintings of the Parisian salons, are fantasy machines, representations that display desire instead of consuming it. And that's a very interesting thing. There is always this display of stuff, and it's never kind of arousing. You know, there's this enormous distance. While in the Sade's work, events take place in obscurity, they are not kept there, for he reveals everything to us. So things happen in dungeons, in Mount Vesuvius, very kind of like remote places because they are criminal, they cannot see or cannot be seen, but at the same time, his type of writing sheds an enormous harsh light on it. It's part of Enlightenment literature. It's very interesting, this paradox. You go into a dungeon, but still it's very visible what has been happening there. It's very clear. It's not dark. It's a very interesting thing, that the darkness is here metaphorical. The Marquis eliminates all kind of darkness. He sheds this harsh light. His narratives consist in a long series of scenes. It's not the development of individual characters, relationships, or the plot is unimportant. But the presentation of every imagined excess, that's important, the presentation. Not only are stage scenes enacted within the stories, but also throughout. His characters use the language of spectacle, calling attention to the exaggeration and cliché of the drama in which they are involved. It's all visual, it's all images. Just as nothing is left unsaid, nothing is left unseen, and everything is performed. According to Roland Barthes, again, one can discern three operative strategies in Marquis de Sade: to isolate, to articulate, and to command. More specific, Barthes described it as volupté de classification, rage de découper, obsession numérative, pratique de l'image, and couture du système social. The first operational condition for the Marquis that leads to deviation of the bourgeois ideology and the liberal repressive discourse, and that leads to derange the institution of language, is isolation, the exclusion of the system of civilization. This happens in such a way that it allows creating a linguistic void, the exclusion of known languages, of natural, physical, and classy languages. There is no interference, and that allows for a new language to be elaborated. So it's kind of an abstraction. It's in a separate world. It's in fact, what I try to describe is the world where art happens. It's not the world where we happen. It's the biggest mistake of one of my favorite artists, Alan Capro, was thinking that art was life. So, but of course, it's also one of my favorite artists, so I also agree with him. But in this discourse, I disagree with him. In Sade's writing, the criminal is intimately linked to dark, enclosed, hidden, or remote locations. The isolated country, the chateau, the bedroom, convents and monasteries, fortresses, underground chambers, and even Mount Vesuvius. But these locations act as stage sets again. They are not real. They are sets. They are theater. They are kind of like mise en scène. For the individual or actual locations are meaningless surveys. They serve as class and power signifiers and are important for the threatening nature of their isolation. The articulation of time and space, metalinguistic articulations, everything is subjected to rules of combination composition, and this allows a formalization of invented language. So, where are we going? We are trying to find, for me, I try to find the motivation for this exhibition, The Grand Balcony. There are other things, and there are impress texts. There is the inspiration of the Jean Genet piece. There is the inspiration of the gasoline station of Mies van der Rohe here in Montreal. But now I want to go in a logic from this image. You know, the kind of the animated and the inanimate image. So I'm searching for this dialectics of an aesthetic of disenchantment on the one hand, and an aesthetic of animation and animism on the other hand. It's about this oscillation. You know, that's what we people always do in, let's say, more Western art history, is kind of like how we consider images alive or not. And that's a very important thing. And I do this because I've been very critical lately about the exhibitions that account for their existence towards the demands and expectations of contemporary economical and social political realms. The attempts to create relationships between people over and above institutionalized and capitalist relational forms. It's all these exhibitions today have that as a motto, you know, and I don't believe in it. So many artists and curators today capitalize on anachronistic token forms of revolt, which reads as quasi-nihilism with agitated rhetorical gestures in the sadly more and more hollow aim to save a last bit of democracy. And I'm more interested in these rhetorical gestures, because that's what stays, or that's what stays in a memorized or a memory of an image world. I'm much more, that's why it's called The Grand Balcony. That's why there is so much reflection on meta-theatrical kind of like, that's why there's so much reflection on meta-theatricality. Because I don't really believe, I think politics have to transperse through the works. I don't believe that I think that's extremely preposterous as a curator, can put a concept that is political and kind of like as a, what would it be? A public intellectual say how we're going to save the world? I don't think so. So, more inspiration, a bit sadistic. One is in the show, probably. The other is, we should lend this one too, Sylvie. It's in the Museum of Fine Arts. And it can go in one of the rotunda things, you know, next to Lucas Granach, a fellow German. I'm not German, but adopted it. And Hubert Robert, French, post-Rococo, between neoclassicism, etc. Completely wrong, politically terribly incorrect, but beautiful. And it has a reminiscence of the movement of Ramses II. Anyway, the last little paragraph on the side, which is probably the most interesting thought that one could connect to the exhibition. Marquis de Sade struggled with the paradoxes of the bourgeois principle of formal equality. His project was a democracy of pleasure, and it crashes on the fact that democracy can only be a democracy of subjects, not of objects. There is no democracy of objects. The respective realms of fantasy, and we can add here art and aesthetics, and the symbolical law, on the other hand, are not comparable. With other words, it is a characteristic of fantasy to resist universalization. I think that's a very important thing when we deal with art. Fantasy is the absolutely individual way in which someone gives structure to his or her impossible relation to the things, or to the thing, to the object world. To the classical human rights, Marquis de Sade tried to add the right on pleasure. And that's impossible because pleasure acts through fantasy. And so there is this kind of like incredible paradox that he could locate, which was one of the impossibilities of the philosophy of the Enlightenment. And that's the interesting thing. These are partly fantasy machines. You know, certainly the one on the right. It's a fantasy machine. It's the kind of like the image you kind of like, you catch yourself that you don't want to think this, but you still think it. That's what art sometimes can do. It gives the image of what you don't want to think, but you still think it. And there you come close to some things that Marquis de Sade did. This is something else. I think the fantasy around this portrait is kind of like coming after the facts. The portrait is kind of like, it's changed over the course of history. Some people said there used to be a plate in her hands with the head of Holofernes, the decapitated head of Holofernes. And it would become Judith and Holofernes, which Granach painted very often. But in fact, the head disappeared, or the plate at least disappeared. Some people say there was never a head, but there was a basket. At least there was something in her hands. And the right arm is being overpainted. But at the same time, which is very beautiful, her handkerchiefs seem to have eyes. There is like life in this thing. There is something that comes to life. Then there is the adornment with the chain. The chain is so heavy that it suggests almost a certain type of self-torture, of bondage. And it's the preferred subject of Lucas Granach. Her name is Sidonia of Saxony. She was one of the financiers of Martin Luther, which is also an interesting little anecdote on the. And she was, how do you say it? How do you say that in English? They inculpated, or no, with witchcraft. She was tried to be a witch, but then they discovered she wasn't. Very great science. No, it's true. They said she was a witch, but then apparently she has proven she wasn't. I always thought those processes ended up with only witches, but no. So it's quite an interesting character, and we think she commandeered the painter that she would abandon the Judith and Holofernes subject matter, that she was worthwhile a portrait. And she comes back in many, many portraits. It's hanging in Winnipeg, and probably it's going to hang in the biennial soon. So these are some of these kind of like incredible, complex fantasy machines that artworks can be. So that's the type of research, and it's a research that is kind of accompanied by an idea of detachment in order to take, in fact, a critical position in relation to fundamental sentiments that were very often taken up by art exhibitions, such as the interpersonal, the philanthropic, do-good and feel-good moralism. I hope to try to invoke something else, something that could be the laughter of resistance. Try to squeeze some measure of freedom out of our obstructionist universe against political, bureaucratic, linguistic, and theoretical recuperation. Or we are kind of held at ransom by them. So the idea is how to step out of the vicious circle of the subversive. Because each critique today in the cultural field is immediately absorbed or turned in a cultural good or in a commercial good. So the exhibition, I hope, and that was what I initially said is the exhibition I imagine, becomes a space that would inform us about ourselves, uninvited, like all good artworks do. In that sense, it doesn't provide solace because things are not necessarily revealing themselves as truths. It's a space of the mistake where one can go astray. The exhibition, I imagine, excludes the possibility to be a promesse de bonheur. I go back now to some artworks that are not all in the exhibition, but that are important to this. Okay, this is still going with the Sade. It's Nicole Eisenman, which will be in the biennial. Then we go here. This is 10 years ago. Very important collaboration for me with American artist Cory McCorkle, who is advisor on this biennial project. This intervention is called Crystal Chain Leather Complex Dark Episode. It's installed in the main hall of the Kunsthalle Bern. The volumetric operation blacked out the existing skylights. I'll show you that in fact, yeah, you don't see it very well, but this is the skylight. Yeah? There is normally milky glass in it. And what he did, he kind of like denied the function of a typical ideal exhibition hall with daylight coming through. The daylight is obstructed. The daylight is kind of like becoming a coagulant thing that drops through the grid. So the skylights are blacked out with plastic black panels resting in the crystal-like skylight armature. Each of the panels was blown with maximum amount of air that could be pushed into molten plastic. So the form was decided by physical restraints rather than by artistic decision or taste. These volumetric black panels, reminiscent of so much 80s design, according to Corey, dark episode in design, resituated the Gothic vogue of much contemporary art around 2005, characterized by an engagement with darkness in an already existing and epic Gothic framework. It's very Gothic. The title Crystal Chain Leather Complex Dark Episode connects the piece to the Crystal Chain Group. Sometimes known as the Utopian Correspondence, the group entertained a chain letter between November 1919 and December 1920. This was a correspondence of architects initiated by Bruno Taut, formed as a basis of expressionist architecture in Germany. In a series of dazzling, fantastic letters and drawings in which the crystal was central, the members of the group described their visions of an ideal society and of a beneficent architecture. The crystal served as a symbol of power, harboring social utopias. It ironically was both a means of keeping the spirit of romanticism alive in the modern age, while simultaneously reinforcing the modern inclination towards rational structures and mass reproduction. In McCorkle's installation, this utopia is dead. The installation is an allegorical ruin of a modernist nightmare. The monumental span of this piece inverted the elegiac celebration of the diffuse light, of a cathedral, for instance, with something sculptural, opaque, and not unrelated to the astonishment of menace of the sublime. A reference to a sinister but stylish sci-fi dystopia seems more to the point. On one occasion, the artist paired criticism uttered on his installation by murmuring the typical sound indicated the presence of Darth Vader, a master of the dark side of the Force in the Star Wars movies. That was the only thing he said when a journalist said that this was kind of a bit crypto-fascist. And he did... But I like, the anecdote is important, you know, instead of answering with discourse, it's answering with the invocation of an image. And I think it's a very, very important thing. The volumetric panels, resplendently descending from the metal grid into the hall, could indeed be described as oppressive. They refuse the portal, promoting a necessary and beloved agent, natural light, to contemplate art. And indeed, the Kunsthalle was empty for the rest. We only did this, inserted something in this transitory space which allowed light to come in. A lot of people came in and said, oh, there's no show, and went away. Very interesting. I liked that a lot. Moreover, the fundamental characteristic of the physical vehicle of the exhibition, the continuous surface of the gallery wall, structured solely for the display of art, was not only kept empty, but our gaze was beguiled by a glimmering and menacing ceiling. The intervention transformed the exhibition hall in a space in which the marvelous coincides with an essential disorientation. McCorkle follows Marcel Duchamp's 1200 coal sacks, being an obvious predecessor to the piece, in combining two hallowed surrealist concepts, le merveilleux and le dérèglement, a kind of awestruck wonder and confusion. Moreover, each panel mirrored the empty main hall of the Kunsthalle, becoming a revelatory but at the same time foreboding sight. Upon entering the main hall of the Kunsthalle, spectators in fact found themselves plunged in a fantastic metaphor of surveillance, arrested by a gigantic crystalline structured fly eye. The bodies of the beholders couldn't escape the physical breakthrough of this seemingly fluid ceiling, as if it was thick ink threatening to flood the house. To me, this work, on which I had the privilege to collaborate with the artist, has always been paramount. As an exhibition maker, I'm interested in these ideas of an artwork as a folly, devoted in its own way to fetish and spectacle that claims its autonomy within a network of references. I go to a film which is made now by the same artist, which we will see in the biennial. Let's hope it works. Oh, wait. Yeah, there we are. Monument. The title suggests all the grandeur of equine statuary. The film is just 5 minutes of shots of Zachary. Here is Zachary. A stately black horse in a Midwestern farm. While not immediately apparent, it becomes clear that the animal is blind. His dark, lustrous coat extends right over his eye sockets, an effect of a rare degenerative disease. The film is comprised of shots of the horse from different angles and distances. But halfway through the cinematic portrait, the horse is centered on screen in profile, as if posing for some generic 19th century equestrian painting. In his book, La peinture préhistorique, Lascaux ou la naissance de l'art, Georges Bataille muses on the horses, bisons, cows, deer, and other animals depicted in motion on walls of the ancient caves in southwestern France. In these Paleolithic paintings, Bataille finds an ambivalent celebration of the animal and the definition of the human rooted in art as a transgressive praxis, an excessive pursuit of the useless. McCorkle put, when he showed this film for the first time, he had no press release. He only put Bataille's book, Lascaux, la naissance de l'art. That was his press release. And it's very interesting. For him, this kind of like the celebration of the animal, which is also a recurrent thing in his work, and the definition of the human rooted in art as a transgressive practice, an excessive pursuit of the useless. This is something that is, for me, then again, very important, this excessive pursuit of the useless. I think that's a very important, one of the most interesting definitions for art. But then back to this film. The uneasiness prompted by the close and contemplative proximity to Zachary, the intimidating silence of the film, and the darkness of the barn in which Zachary tramples around, summon a hallowed temple for an uncanny and sacred encounter. It is the sacred animal, very close to what Bataille describes. As the horse cannot return our gaze, monument again returns us to ourselves. I think that's again this kind of like this impossible meeting. You know, there is this idea that transgressive is also about this meeting, this communal thing, but it's at the same time, in this piece, again, impossible. The same with the black ceiling. The same with some paintings of the Sade. The same with Lucas Granach. There is this kind of like, it pushes you back. You're not allowed there. It's almost religious. Noli me tangere. Don't touch me. It's a very interesting thing that kind of like puts this barrier between art and life. You know, art puts this barrier between art and life. And that's not for all art. Again, we can invoke Capro and others. But it's a kind of, it's something that runs through probably what this biennial will be. There is this kind of very interesting like choice for fiction, choice for a distance between art and life. So about this space that we try to invoke, I'm going to quote another artist, Knut Asdam. And in one of his films, he says, "You can feel this place eats up your inside. Slowly, and then one day you are dead in Zombie Town. But you'll have loads of zombies to hang around with." Maybe another metaphor for what this exhibition hopefully could be. Again, about this metaphorical darkness. Let's go back to the... where is it? Okay. Now we have to go like this again. Sorry. Yeah. In most of the films of Knut Asdam, also an artist who is present in the biennial, he's from Norway, a metaphorical darkness envelops the scenes, even those happening in daytime. The dark helps us to acknowledge a change in our environmental awareness and the ways in which the architecture and modern experience of urban life have unseated us and caused a sense of disorientation and spatial and temporal confusion. The logic of light, on the contrary, so important in film, is parallel to the logic of sight and puts everything under a gaze which understands and rationalizes. But in Knut Asdam's work, the realm of the semi-dark is one suffused with possibilities. This metaphorical dark or shadowy world is an important aspect of his oeuvre, not only within photography and film, but also in presentation, characterizing the installation that hosts the films. So this is a kind of a still. I'll show a part of a film later, but here you see how he installs it. He will never accept just a normal black box, which is abstract, which is kind of a non-place. What is very important for him is that it's a place, that it has real architecture, that it's a real place inhabited or inscribed by people, inscribed by narrative. The film has a narrative, the public has a narrative. Important in his work is always people in relation to architectural environments. This is Tripoli in Lebanon, and this is how he installed, in fact, again at the Kunsthalle Bern, an entrance to his 2 movie projections. One had to first walk through a nocturnal park. So we installed a complete park in the same hall where the black skylight was. The door you come in, it's kind of like a vestibule. And he wanted to adapt your eyes to the darkness and before you see the films, to go through this nocturnal park. The nocturnal park, of course, invokes all the references of, I don't know, crossing, all kind of thing. What people do in nocturnal parks, you know, is this it was this whole idea to invoke all that kind of fantasies, narratives, etc. More recently, he uses also fences, the typical fences that are used to kind of seam off urban spaces for youth to play. It reminds one of sports areas in modern urban situations. But when you see the films, they remain in a kind of semi-darkness. So contrary to Enlightenment traditions, Knut Asdam seems to suggest something positive about darkness again. Asdam mobilizes the inherent incompleteness of light and darkness, negating any totalizing impulse coming either from the realm of light or that of darkness. His darkness is immanent, not suggesting neutrality as black boxes do, making the imperative of visibility for the audience a delusion of grandeur, or better still, of control. It suggests a loss of place in favor for a subjectified and therefore possibly claustrophobic urban environment. So it's kind of like he wants to install subjective space. It's kind of like based on the one hand, Henri Lefebvre, this Marxist philosopher who kind of like wrote at a certain moment against the bureaucratic idea of space, which was called linear space, and the opposition to that Lefebvre called recalcitrant space. It's the type of space that is kind of motivated by us, by people, which is written by us in our actions. And that's a very important thing for Asdam. The other thing, which is important for him, I'll show you another still, a very iconic image out of one of his movies. People exchanging this, how do you say that, like this, safety pin while kissing. I go to a movie, sorry, by Mr. Asdam. I hope it works. Oh. Sorry. Wait a bit. think we have it. Is it gonna? Voila. This one is not very dark. I'm gonna go somewhere. What Asdam mostly kind of like, so it's very light in this one. I'm lying all the time. Although there is, the darkness is somewhere else. The darkness is not just happening in the imagery. So Asdam's work has often been related to the concept of psychasthenia. Somebody heard of psychasthenia? Yeah. Developed by the surrealist Roger Caillois in the 30s of the last century. Caillois speaks of legendary psychasthenia as symptoms of disturbances in the relationship between personality and space. Darkness is an important element in Caillois' concept as something that is filled, which can touch the individual directly. So darkness has matter, has a certain materiality to it. It is filled. It's not kind of like abstract. He borrows these ideas from Eugene Minkowski, who suggested that darkness not only envelops the individual, but also penetrates him. The ego is permeable for darkness, while it is not so for light. According to Caillois, a person can undergo depersonalization by being assimilated to space. So there is something that also comes back in the Cairo film, you know, the individual becomes so identified with the surroundings that he is absorbed by it and loses his or her own identity. In Asdam's work, this relationship of contiguity goes for the protagonists in his films as for the spectators in his film installations. So what happens to us is in fact the same as what happens in the films. That's what he tries to do in the way he installs his work. It's kind of like we become mirrored, or we are mirrors to what happens in the film, or the film is a mirror to how we think, relate, and move in the spaces he constructs. Night or obscurity favor this merger between what Caillois calls the organism, the agent or the living creature, and the milieu. Caillois considers this temptation by space as a mimetic act, by no means offensive, so not designed to surprise a prey, nor defensive, in which the agent adapts to and makes itself resemble its surroundings in an effort to protect itself from a predator. That's not the case. It's kind of like a positive thing, this kind of like being tempted by the milieu. It is non-utilitarian, again, or rather aimless. The agent, in this case the character or the audience, renders itself similar in an act of pure automatism. Spaces are invented in a convulsive possession, and the living creature, or the character in the film, or the spectator in the installation, is no longer the origin of the coordinates, but one point among others. It is dispossessed of its privilege and literally no longer knows where to place itself. Indonesian philosopher Gunawan Muhammad Kalam points at the parallelism between Adorno's theory of mimesis and psychasthenia. Mimetic behavior, according to Adorno, does not imitate something, but assimilates itself into something. Adorno avoids the word imitation, in German Nachahnung, for it suggests too active a role for the subject. Instead, his word is anschmiegen, meaning to snuggle up or mold oneself to. Mimesis, for him, is also understood as the non-conceptual affinity of a subjective creation, Roger Le Caillois' living creature, with its objective and unposited object. So that's the world in which Knut Asdam functions, and for me it's also one, just as Corey, a very important artist in kind of building up not necessarily a structure, but an atmosphere for the show. And so it's kind of like the idea to build up more and more. What I do here is only one way. There are different kind of like vectors coming into the exhibition, so there is also contradictions of this. The rest you'll see at the biennial of this film. Where was I? No. Here it is. I have to do it each time again. Probably I don't know the program right. So, somebody knows this image? No. We come to that. I have a lot of more Asdam and Kaiwa and stuff like that. The only thing I still want to talk about is, before going to the last part, I don't find. Oh, I find it. I'm sorry. Is this idea of zombies. Yes, that's it. Yeah, that's the next chapter. In Asdam's films, there is an author, and I just jump on that. We can talk about it if you're more interested. That considers his characters zombies. That's very interesting. There is the whole idea of the zombie. I didn't write about it in the catalog, sadly enough, but it's another important thing. Zombification is easily applied to the notion that capital eats up the body and mind of the worker, and that the living are exploited through dead labor. That's what Lars Bang Larsen writes about it. It's very political all of a sudden. It's kind of like, I don't know if I totally agree. I agree with the metaphor, but I don't agree necessarily with applying that completely to Knut's characters, although Knut would agree with it. But I see it more, again, as a sort of mise en scène, and as a... I think the bodies or characters in Knut Asdam's films seem to be the last survivors in an urban post-zombification world, conscious of the damage done, manifesting rather a mirror neuron malfunction in relation to subjective interiority. So they act very weird. They are like wandering through these very strange landscapes, urban landscapes, architectural oddities, and they talk in written language. They don't talk as human beings. They have conversations as texts. So they are very Marquis de Sade-like. They are like this weird language-based or image-based abstractions. They are not real. And that's something I think is very, very important. And that has something to do with zombies in one or another way. But the whole zombie theory, it's too long to go through it. And the zombie theory, it's something to read. The interesting thing is Asdam's characters are conscious of their mimetic drive, which is frustrated in relation to a subject with interiority. And so that's why they constantly search that, like to become characters. They're never characters. They are denied access to the world of classical mimesis, how we kind of imitate each other. They are doomed to, and that's the very zombie part of it. That's where I get back to the logic of the thing. They are doomed to mimicry, or mimicry. How do you say that in English? Mimicry, yes. Even if they try to resist this form of self-effacement, namely the elimination of difference between their imagined self and their environment. So that's this very interesting thing that Knut developed since the 90s, and I found it back very recently with a young artist in live work. And it's one of the ambitious projects of the biennial. I found it back with Anna Imhof. I found, in fact, the movement and the way Knut Asdam's characters function in his films back in Anna Imhof's performances. So Anna Imhof is a young German artist, and we are presenting a big ambitious performance with her. And her first work was based on this, Luc Bresson, L'École des Pickpocket. And it was, if you see the images, it's quite interesting because it evolved to something now which is very different. So this is one of her first performances when she was still a student at school. And it's kind of like a choreography based on pickpocket movements, which she did with the students of the school. So it's still it's a mise en scène, but very basic. And it was called the School of the Seven Bells. It developed into a performance. So Anna Imhoff's School of the Seven Bells is primarily based on a range of hand gestures by which an object is moved from one hand to the other. In his 1959 movie, The Pickpocket, Robert Bresson portrays a group of pickpockets who let their loot circulate among a group of accomplices until its location is no longer traceable and they can leave crime scene. Their transactions range between the inscrutable, the obvious, and the faked. Very important. The inscrutable, the obvious, and the faked. It's again this play between mise en scène, taking up roles, performative. Imhoff adapts and internalizes the motions of these transactions with a group of performers who she has collaborated with throughout various performances over time. These performances constantly expand the spectrum of motions throughout the rehearsals by teaching each other motions that originate from their personal habits. And that's still happening in our actual performances. They're based on subculture movements, they're based on, in a sense, bodily movements that people kind of like do. Like there's certain codes. There's the codes of bouncers, there's the codes of certain language in the street, etc. And it's this kind of thing that her performances are people involved in different scenes. Some of them were bouncers, some of them are dancers, some of them are, but they're involved in, and they bring in their own language, their own body language. And of course she brings in stuff too, you know, that she lets them do. And so she develops further and further certain things. And all these gestures, again, very important, they become abstractions. They are not, the importance is not in their reference. The importance is in what they are by themselves. And I think that's, again, it's a very important, for me, thematic in this exhibition, that this kind of cutting loose the things you see from their documentary value, from their referential value. And of course, it's unavoidable. It always comes in. But it's a very interesting thing to kind of like, where does it become art? It's the moment it becomes pleasurable because of itself. And it's not pleasure in content, but it's pleasure in experience. And it's something that kind of like prolongs your experience. You know, it's good art. It's not something that you say, aha, and you get it. It's something that kind of like creates time in experience. And for that, it has to obstruct its own meaning. Because the moment you get the meaning, it's done. And it's gone. It goes away. It has to kind of constantly suggest and obstruct, suggest and obstruct. It has to obstruct its own medium, its own content. And that's what I think personally, I don't have to agree with that, but people like Corey, Knut, and in this case, Anna Imhoff are extremely talented in kind of like constantly misguiding the viewer. You think you see something and it goes somewhere else, and it takes you away somewhere else. So her performers constantly expand the spectrum of motions throughout the rehearsals by teaching each other other motions that originate from their personal habits. In their entirety, these motions could be summarized as follows: interactions that structure public space, but that require privacy and intimacy. So that's things that happen outside in the world, but that are in fact private. Cruising, secret salutations, and again, we're close to the dark part of Knut Asdem. Waiting for the man, pickpocketing, flirting, and transactions based more on crossing lines of sight than official communication. The core group of actors is expanded for each performance by local acquaintances, who are instructed in the choreography only a few hours or a few days in advance, and who therefore only receive incomplete information, which limits their ability to act. The internal politics of organized gangs functions similarly, with inner and outer circles as a means of self-protection. The sequence of these motions isn't based on a fixed logic. They serve rather to maintain a constant fluidity. Inactive performers kneel, waiting along the gallery walls beside the audience, trying to re-enter the action at the moment of their choosing. Also, that is very beautiful. You step out of the fantasy, you step into the fantasy. And there is also a very beautiful moment in the Knut Asdem movie where you see the actors hanging around, and the moment the clapper goes, they step into their role. It's like this getting out of the performative role and in. And in Anna's work, this is something that is constantly happening. Sometimes the actors or performers are hanging around with us, and it's very uncanny because you share, all of a sudden you really share space with them, and then they kind of like leave your space. They become image again, and they create the distance again, which is very, very interesting. Here you don't see it, it's still very intimate, but then in other performances, you would see it. It's very difficult to render in images. I have a bit of a piece of movie, but it's something to absolutely experience. I'll just go quickly through the images here. I can wait with this one. The result of these various intertwined motions is a meshwork of vectors constantly changing its rhythm, pace, and direction. Its systematics becoming increasingly indecipherable for the viewer as for the participating performers. They are kind of like getting instructions through their cell phones. So there is a part improvisation. They know like when they get a certain instruction, they have to start a certain cycle of movements, a certain cycle of gestures. But it's kind of like it's not completely written out. So, and Anna and sometimes another person within her team gives instructions through the cell phone. So they have their cell phones with them. Sometimes they are like we do, looking at the screen, hanging around, but then they get like an instruction, and then the whole kind of like performance acquires another moment and another movement. The performance is thus based on a system that unifies essentially incommensurable singular units on different levels of access. It therefore, and that's what I think is very interesting, performs collapse. It's something that constantly there's a big entropy and it always collapses. It's never you have the suggestion of a moment of a kind of like a great moment, but it's always kind of like diverting from that. It becomes very spectacular, but it collapses again. And it's this kind of rendering of the image of collapse, of something a world that is collapsing, a world where you cannot really, you see it here, you cannot do a lot against, or you cannot change a lot. It's maybe pessimistic in a certain sense, and it's very actual to. It kind of is a very interesting mirrors to a lot of gestures that happen today in the street, and it's not necessarily the revolting gesture, but the kind of like the fatalistic gestures, the gesture of accepting. So it's a very strange kind of message in this work. I don't believe in works with message, but this is very strange. It's all very fatalistic and accepting. So it's kind of like one could criticize it enormously when one would think about emancipatory necessities or urgencies. And I think this kind of like, okay, accepting that art cannot change the world. That it's kind of, art can do a lot, but it cannot change the world. And that's a very interesting, I had a conversation with a lot of artists that in fact agree with that say like, we are not there to change the world. We are only there to create vessels that kind of like carry knowledge for moments and times and places that this knowledge can be taken open and understood, or kind of like again and again. It's almost Benjaminian in the idea of the dialectical image, like that art is mobilized again and again and is never kind of like exhausted. Good art. Its meaning is never exhausted. The meanings can come out of it because of actualizations. But a lot of people, and probably there's other ones, but a lot of the people I've been talking to, the artists in the Grand Balcony, a lot of them don't believe in the fact that art would be able to change the world. And it's a pathway. You could follow another one. You could go for the believers, But there is a lot more, there's a different kind of attitude in all this. So Anna Imhoff, her performances, they last several hours until it could be assumed that all possible courses of action have been completed. And it increasingly estranges its participants, including the audience. It's very, you less and less and less know what you have seen. It's very interesting. You have the impression at a certain moment that you start to understand what you have seen, and the longer you stay, the less you understand what you have seen. You observe, you comprehend, you act, you rest, you act again, you repeat. In fact, there is not really a repetition. There is an entropy of repetition. There is this kind of idea that there is repetition because certain gestures always come back. But in fact, there is an entropy about what they would mean. You know, they get abstracter and abstracter, or more and more autonomous. The estrangement lies in the realization on the part of all participants that they aren't components of this apparent system, but singular, unconnectable units. And indeed, at a certain moment, they move sometimes together, but you see that there is, according to the instructions given by the artist, there is an entropy also in the kind of like the duration of the performance, so that every actor becomes a separate unit at some point. The consequences of their actions are as abstract as the consequences of their non-participation. It's a kind of interesting thing. They sometimes rest, they are interacting, but there is not a real participation in their interaction, and their actions have no consequences. It's coming out of the world where it had meaning, but it loses its meaning. So the what the fuck factor becomes very obvious there. It's like, what the fuck, what is this, you know? It's a hyper-stimulated passivity in which all hypothetical assumptions throw the participants so far back to themselves that they only and exclusively represent themselves. So there is a fashion element in there. It's a representation of their character, which increasingly shows in their behaviors. But fashion, again, is also abstract. The more and more it goes on, the more and more it kind of adopts not the movements, but kind of the atmosphere of a catwalk. You know, it's a catwalk of cool youth, if you would reduce it completely. But there is so many other things happening that it hovers again. You always think there will be meaning installed, but in fact, in the end, not. I think I can conclude here. Yeah. We can still add some theory to that. Artaud, Fassbinder, blah, blah, blah. You want to see an excerpt of a performance of Anna? There is very often live animals. And in her older performance, there was, so it's interesting, they evolve. So now it will not be very similar anymore to that one. But each time she kind of keeps stuff out of the older ones and brings it into the new ones. And they had a lot of interactions with basins with condensed milk. And I don't know, it's almost Caproian. They exchange material, they exchange liquids. There is trades that there's kind of like exchanging and trading of things. You don't know what is at stake exactly. Wait a bit. And some of the people in here will also be in the performance in Montreal. She has some fetish bodies and faces that always come back. Some others not. So it's always, there is change and repetition in there. And in this case, she had a kind of a blacklight atmosphere. Recently in Berlin, there was a completely different atmosphere. So people also doom up out of light or out of fog. And very often it's undiscernible whether they are performers or fellow spectators. It's a very interesting kind of like small place of difference. Here, of course, for the film, it's only the performance. You don't see. It's kind of like, I don't know. It's a couple of years ago. Anyway, for sure there are questions, remarks, critiques.
I think it's a good time to open up for questions.
Benjamin.
First, I'm very excited to see the show now. I mean, I wasn't before, but all these things made me very excited. And then also very excited to be part of it. And, what I've heard makes so much sense to me that I'm very interested in. And I also I could answer one of the questions you asked. The artists you work with, do you think you can say that change the world or say the world, things like that. And I also, I have a few more earrings. I have this one, but there's something I'm very interested in, and I think it's also interesting on the way from complete sad to there's this playwright, Georg Büchner, who's very interesting and most people play more than play.
Otherwise, I don't understand. Should I stop that one? Maybe I stop this. Or I put it silent.
Yes. So dans son test, from the so the playwright tells the story of the moment where Danton gets guillotined by Ouest here, and there's also like interesting zombie ideas. The idea that everybody has stopped the revolution, the last one is still alive because he also enjoys his body. He has a more interesting thing, the presence of the body. And so the world play is terrible because you see Danton at the end, his head is cut with all his friends, and very depressing because it also marks the end of the revolution and of the parts of the revolution. And then at the end of the play, you have the killer, the guy who activates the guillotine, and he ends the play alone. He's the last person on stage. And he asks his friend, "Oh, where are you going tonight?" He says, "Oh, just go home." He says, "Okay, I go with you." And then he leaves the stage and he sings a little song that says, "When I come back home, the moon will lighten my path." It's really sweet end of the play. And that's very terrible because you just saw a play that was full of murderers and blood, and you saw head that was shocked, and really terrifying. And there's here something very interesting, this idea of where because I think the question is right to this question, what art means and what is left. And the question here in Danton play is to say, you have to come home and not be terrified while you saw it. You have to come home and be nourished by it. We have to understand what the revolution was and how we can still be active how can we still be active if we know that everybody dies at the end? It's terrible. And so how can we get an experience from that I could activate my own life? And so there's something really beautiful in the last line that permits the transition in the dark space of the...
Whose play is it? Mm-hmm. Whose play is it?
Büchner.
Ah, yeah.
And so there's really something beautiful in this idea that how can you see such dark things, and how can you experience such dark things?
And also, it reinstates that seeing the dark things is pleasurable.
Yeah. It's an experience.
But that's only possible when it's fiction.
Yeah.
You know, and that's, yeah. Not in the beginning, it was not from the outset for the biennial a strategy, but more and more it became clear that it's a lot about that also. And Yeah. And that's why also the Genet piece is, it's a bit more, even more pessimistic in a certain sense, because the revolution is happening outside of the brothel, but there is this kind of like non-belief in the revolution, and at the same time, the absurdity of the existing powers that are negotiating each other. So it's a very strange limbo. And of course, things happen, but they reinstate that kind of situation. It's less cruel on the one hand, but it's also less optimistic in the end. Yeah. But again, it's a lot about how everything is staged. You know how.
The original is really it's still optimistic.
Yeah.
Everybody dies.
Even if everybody dies.
Thank you so much for the talks in such an extensive way. You presented many of the parameters that shape the biennial as an exhibition. You talked about the dialectics between the aesthetic of disenchantment and animism, or also perversion as an aesthetic, as being one of the point of interest for you to put on display. But I was very struck by the fact that you used the word mise en scène and talked a lot about theater, and starting with the first image, the Royal Weird Show, which is a machine of display. And so I understand that you're very interested in dispositifs, or you used the Gauthorian words of agencement, and I wonder if you could develop or comment on how you think of the biennial as a dispositif, or how the biennial can activate this meta-theatricality you're interested in.
Well, good question. That's what we always say when we have to think a bit. No, I don't know. I approached this not as a biennial. Like, I would always do as a curator, if I have to do a museum exhibition, I wouldn't approach it as a museum exhibition. Maybe it's a bit of a detour. I failed massively, which I now know when I see what we're gonna get. It will be great, but it's not what I initially thought, which is fine. You know, it's probably a beautiful, massive failure. It's the collapse, you know, like it's a total collapse of, I don't know, I wanted initially, biennials, you know, there are so many of them. How many are there in the world now? I think everywhere. And what do biennials do? When they exist a long time, they establish formats in which they exist, and then curators start to play with the format, and they advance another format, which could be, let's do only posters, or which could be, I don't know, there's all this kind of thing. But then the curator becomes too much of a altar on top of the things. And I wanted to go, although it seems, this talk seems very authorial, but it's not. It's kind of like more touching interest points. And there are many more, but this was one path of interest points. Originally, I wanted to step out of the format. Like to see, can we step out of the formats that biennials or all that kind of structure things do? And that's impossible. That's just vain energy that you cannot do. It's just impossible. There are things that, it's a very strange procedure of actions and things and needs, and it was a very interesting experience, but that's totally impossible. And it's kind of like, maybe some older biennials I know, or very new ones, they start with that idea. But then again, it's kind of like, in the end, it bites in its own tail, because then it's all about like, okay, we found a new biennial, but we try it to be not like any other biennial. Then it's not a biennial anymore, or that it runs like what Athens does now. It's running the whole time, or what Oslo wants to do, or something like that. So at a certain moment you accept, well, it's a biennial, it lasts 3 months, it happens every second year. okay, let's go classic, you know, do an exhibition. And maybe it's most important then to do a very good exhibition. In this case, what you bring up, yes, it's a lot. The moment you choose to go in one direction, and the choice of a direction is the choice of a first artwork you want to show, or the first artist you want to collaborate with, brings you to other works. I could have started with Mary Heilman and go abstract. And now I'm a bit sad I didn't do that, because it would be the next biennial, if I ever have the chance to do one again, should be an appallingly dull, monochrome, abstract painting thing, which has never been done in biennial, so you change the format. That would be great. It's not been seen, you know. But in this case, I was having a conversation with Corey, I was having a conversation with Thomas Bayerle, and with other people, and automatically you come into a certain, not a framework. I tried to refuse the format, but more like one artwork leads to another. It's kind of like, okay, you have this piece, and you ask the piece what other piece it wants to have a conversation with, what other piece it wants to have a dispute with. And of course, at a certain moment, it became clear that a lot of the works were reflecting on theatricality. Not all of them. It's also very good to always have a couple of pieces that obstruct, like good art does, its own ideology. You know, the show should obstruct its own ideology. You should encounter works like, I got it up till now, and what is this doing here? You know, that to wake you up again, or to, yeah, there's the Brechtian thing in theater. You know, the tableau. There is a stranger coming into it, a total stranger, and it's an art piece that is kind of like not logic in the show, and that should happen sometimes. So there is pieces that when people ask me like, what is this doing here? I wouldn't know. It's like, I don't know. It's like, and then of course journalists get very angry because you're the curator, you should know. Yeah? You're the public intellectual that has to know. No, I don't. I just think it felt good, you know. Or somebody said to me I had to, and I trust that person, like Corey or Kitty or some of the advisors or some of the other artists. And so, yes, in this show, it's a lot about bodies and architecture, mise en scène, Selbstdarstellung, performance in a certain sense. Selbstdarstellung is like how you make an image of yourself, which is important in the Jean Genet thing, which is important in the history of portraiture, the Lucas Granach painting. There is a direct line from the Lucas Granach painting to the Anna Imhoff people, you know? It's very clear. But there is also like works like maybe what Benjamin does is also like ironizing that, you know, like to kind of like take the cool out of cool, you know, and that are works that are obstructing the medium of the ideology of this exhibition. And maybe they connect to others, to Frances Stark, to other people in the show, and then these works are obstructing that, you know? It's like, these were all dark and serious, but there's a lot of humor in the show too, so it's, I don't know, it's somehow works lead to other works, and works demand the way they want to be installed, and it's kind of like we are trying to do the impossible exercise to try to follow artists and to listen to works. So with Hassan Khan, we publish a book at the end of the biennial. He will have a video in the show in the end, but normally the initial idea, the first thing we wanted to do with him was not to present the work, but to publish a book. And we published a book with his collected writings. And that was, in the beginning, we were maybe even more radical about that. Like, okay, that's what Hassan wants to do now, you know, or what we would want to do together. And there are like moments like that. We also did like, I think it will be also ready at the opening, we will have a book which is not a catalog. It's a textbook with mostly fiction in it. But kind of quasi-fiction. It's always oscillating, like all the stories could be real in there. But are they or aren't they? That's up to you. But it's rather the idea to have a book that at least you want to read one article in it, and not like, okay, a biennial catalog, university library, Once in a while, oh my God, we didn't want to do that. But that's, again, it's not original, you know, like others, it's kind of like we all try to escape that pre-given structure that a biennial is. And I think what is good about a biennial brings, it's kind of a prism in which the world meets the locality, you know, like it's this kind of like dialogue. It's always somewhere. So the somewhere where it happens is important. And if it's an international one, it brings something from out that somewhere. And that clash is quite interesting. And in some places in the world, that's very important because it's the only established art structure. Here, that's not the case. You know, so there's probably other reasons to have invented a biennial. I don't know the answer to that. Why Montreal invented a biennial? Maybe we should ask some other people here, but but there is one, and it has another ambition. It has now the ambition to be part of a, let's say, more an international circuit that makes Montreal's art, contemporary art world, more a hub of a more global conversation. That's what has been told to me. That's what's the ambition now, yeah, since the last edition. Okay, that's interesting, because indeed, Montreal, sorry, don't kill me, is not part of that conversation. So, but one biennial cannot solve that. So I think we can allow ourselves to act without consequences. Your art world can't. You know, that's very important, I think. You have to love or hate it, but do something with it. I don't know. I don't know if it's an answer to your question.
Are there any other questions? If not, before you've taken us on quite a ride from Ramazzi Square to the Marquis de Sade to Kama Impa. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the Biennale. And thank you very much for coming to join us.
Thanks so much.